On December 26, 1996, 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey became the tragic center of a criminal mystery that began in the Boulder, Colorado home of her parents, John and Patsy Ramsey. That morning, Patsy Ramsey found a handwritten ransom note, 2.5 pages long, demanding $118,000 and telling the family not to contact police. The private household immediately became an active crime scene. Boulder police arrived, and the Ramsey house, a well-to-do residence, was quickly swarmed by investigators and reporters. Hours later, JonBenet's body was discovered in the basement wine cellar. The autopsy listed a skull fracture and asphyxia by strangulation as causes of death. The image of a 6-year-old beauty queen, makeup smeared and left in a cold cellar, crystallized a gruesome national horror. Television vans, tabloid headlines, and cable specials turned living rooms into stages and evidence rooms into battlegrounds. Key physical evidence, the ransom note, fiber evidence, and DNA swabs from the house and the child's clothing became the anchors of a case litigated in public for decades. From the start, investigators, the Ramseys, and the press collided in a frenzy of interviews, leaks, and contested forensics. This was the basic setup: a brutal death, a baffling ransom demand, a high-profile family, and a media juggernaut that shaped every step of the investigation. Errors in crime scene handling, conflicting forensic analyses, and decades of DNA testing and retesting would fuel intense public debate, legal battles, and scrutiny. On the morning of December 26, 1996, the case shifted from terrifying extortion to grisly homicide when JonBenet Ramsey's limp body was found in the cold wine cellar beneath the main staircase of the Ramsey home at 755 15th Street in Boulder, Colorado. Investigators from the Boulder Police Department and the Boulder County Coroner's Office converged on the scene after Patsy Ramsey discovered a 2.5-page handwritten ransom note, and the home was searched. Within hours, the theory of a kidnapping dissolved when the autopsy recorded a skull fracture and asphyxia by strangulation. The discovery turned the Ramsey residence into a macabre tableau: muddy footprints, a child's clothing with fibers and possible blood, and a tangle of evidence in a cramped, chilly cellar that would be photographed, cataloged, and debated for decades. From the first moments, the investigation was hampered by conflicting timelines. Family members gave differing accounts of when JonBenet was last seen, when the ransom note was found, and when phone calls were placed, creating immediate forensic and procedural confusion. Crime scene containment was inadequate by later standards. Neighbors, friends, and journalists had access to the property in the early hours. Family members moved through rooms before systematic evidence collection, and the initial handling of items and the body left the scene open to contamination that would bedevil later DNA and fiber analysis. The ransom note itself, demanding $118,000 and written in block capitals, became both a lodestar and a millstone. Experts and amateurs analyzed its tone, handwriting, and content, but it produced no clear suspect. Subscribe. Maybe the next viewer will crack the handwriting. Media coverage amplified suspicion. National television, tabloid spreads, and cable specials turned private grief into public spectacle and focused intense attention on John and Patsy Ramsey almost immediately. Public and prosecutorial scrutiny quickly centered on family dynamics, inconsistent statements, and the strange elements of the note. That narrative pressure pushed the case into protracted forensic battles, legal maneuvers, and an international media frenzy, setting the stage for the deeper investigative fractures to come. In the weeks after December 26, 1996, the investigation devolved into a war of microscopes and testimony. The messy handling of the crime scene would haunt every lab report. Friends, neighbors, and members of the media flowed through the Ramsey house at 755 15th Street. Family members moved through rooms, and items were bagged without strict chain of custody, leaving fingerprints, fibers, and biological swabs vulnerable to challenge. Boulder police detectives, Boulder County coroner investigators, and federal agents all parsed the ransom note, a 2.5-page demand for $118,000 written in block capitals, and handwriting experts were sharply divided. Some analysts pointed to phrasings and letter forms they said were inconsistent with the Ramseys, while others noted similarities in punctuation and capitalization that stoked suspicion of an inside author. Physical evidence produced equally jagged readings. The autopsy documented a skull fracture and asphyxia by strangulation. A ligature was found at the scene, and clothing showed fibers and stain-like marks. But fiber analysts, blood serologists, and trace examiners disagreed about sources and significance. Early DNA swabs returned ambiguous partial profiles rather than definitive matches, and laboratories in Colorado and at federal facilities reported results that prosecutors and defense teams interpreted in opposite directions. Media narratives hardened into two immovable frames. A national press corps and many armchair sleuths advanced an intruder theory that emphasized a broken-in house and unknown male DNA reported later, while tabloids and some prosecutors zeroed in on inconsistencies in John and Patsy Ramsey's statements, magnifying family theory allegations despite no formal charges. Public opinion calcified on talk shows and headline banners as rival forensic experts litigated basic facts. When the ransom note was written, whether the seller had been secured, and whether DNA evidence suggested contamination or an outside assailant, setting up both a courtroom and a courtroom of public opinion standoff. As lawsuits, leaks, and expert reports multiplied, the investigation split into competing camps, and the case moved toward an even sharper legal and scientific confrontation that would define the next phase. Years after the cellar discovery, advances in forensic science kept reopening the wound without ever closing it. From the late 1990s through the 2000s and into the 2010s, federal and private labs reported partial male DNA profiles on JonBenet's clothing and underwear. Those profiles did not match John or Patsy Ramsey and remained unidentified in national databases. Laboratory reports and court filings describe the genetic traces as degraded, mixed, and partial, the kind of ambiguous material that modern STR and mitochondrial testing can interpret only with important caveats. Every new test sparked headlines and renewed leads. Anonymous tips referenced the partial male profiles. Investigators in Boulder re-examined timelines and people of interest. Forensic genealogists and cold case units debated possible scenarios. At the same time, contamination and chain of custody problems were repeatedly documented. Early mishandling at 755 15th Street, noted by investigators and criticized by later experts, left evidence vulnerable. Items were moved, rooms were trafficked by family and media, and swabs were collected before strict protocols were routine. Analysts and legal filings pointed to those procedural failures as a key reason partial DNA results could not stand alone as definitive proof. Law enforcement responses ranged from renewed grand jury activity to cautious public statements from prosecutors, moves that fed media cycles and public speculation. Civil lawsuits, investigative books, and television documentaries seized on new lab results, while defense-minded experts emphasized contamination risks and the limits of interpretation. The mix of partial, unidentified male DNA, visible crime scene errors, and intermittent prosecutorial pronouncements created a pressure cooker. Each laboratory retest offered the tantalizing chance of a breakthrough and the equal likelihood of another ambiguous report that only deepened disagreement. The result was mounting tension, pushing the case toward a climactic confrontation between what modern forensics might reveal and the procedural chaos that could keep the central question, who murdered 6-year-old JonBenet Ramsey, permanently out of reach. The turning point came when official statements and forensic claims publicly contradicted each other, and the case collapsed into a single grisly question. Who could lawfully be blamed for the skull fracture and asphyxia by strangulation documented in the cold wine cellar beneath 755 15th Street on December 26, 1996? Beginning in the late 1990s and stretching into the 2000s and 2010s, laboratories repeatedly reported partial, degraded male DNA on JonBenet Ramsey's clothing and underwear that did not match John or Patsy Ramsey and remained unidentified in national databases such as CODIS. Boulder County investigators and prosecutors sometimes acknowledged those laboratory results and publicly distanced themselves from the Ramseys. Yet the investigative record also documented contaminated scenes, broken chains of custody, and ambiguous mixed profiles that prosecutors said could not sustain charges. Every new STR test, short tandem repeat, mitochondrial analysis, or touch DNA claim made headlines and renewed the promise of closure, but each also ran headlong into the same legal wall. No unequivocal match, documented procedural errors at the crime scene, and no alternate suspect formally charged. The result was stark and unmistakable. Scientific promise colliding with evidentiary limits, prosecutors publicly distancing the family without naming a perpetrator, and a bloody, unresolved case left hovering between forensic possibility and legal proof, pushing the story into long-term consequences and public reckoning. After the case's climax, when the promise of science collided with the limits of the evidence, the JonBenet Ramsey investigation's aftermath reshaped how the nation scrutinizes crime scene protocols and DNA interpretation. Documented contamination at 755 15th Street and disputed chain of custody spurred calls for stricter evidence handling, laboratory accreditation, and clearer standards for touch DNA and low copy number testing. At the same time, ravenous media coverage, tabloids, cable specials, and talk shows showed how relentless publicity can prejudge suspects and harden public opinion. Amateur sleuthing moved to forums, books, and documentaries, where armchair detectives parse partial STR profiles and anonymous tips, prolonging public obsession. Legal reforms, new training, and improved forensic practices emerged unevenly, and controversies over expert testimony and laboratory errors persist. The human cost remains agonizing. A 6-year-old's brutal death, the torment of John and Patsy Ramsey, and a Boulder community left scarred. The case stands as a macabre warning about scientific limits, media power, and the cultural hunger for closure that sometimes cannot be satisfied.